Each night, young Evan hears his sister Lena quietly crying in her room. Something feels off, and Evan can sense it. Lena's once bright smile has disappeared, replaced by a heavy darkness, ever since their mother's boyfriend entered their lives. But when their mother refuses to listen to Lena's desperate cries, Evan makes a vow to protect her, no matter what. Before we get into this emotional story of loyalty and courage, tell us, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. In the small, quiet town of Willowbrook, nestled somewhere in upstate New York, life for 10-year-old Evan had always been simple, predictable, and safe. He lived with his 13-year-old sister Lena and their mother Rachel in a modest 2-story house on a tree-lined street. While the community around them was quiet, filled with small-town friendliness and familiarity, their home was where Evan felt most at ease. Since his parents divorced 2 years ago, Evan and Lena had grown especially close. Their father, David, now lived about an hour away, and though they saw him every other weekend, it was mostly just Evan, Lena, and Rachel on weekdays. Rachel worked long hours as a nurse, leaving her children with pockets of freedom and responsibility. After school, they would race each other through the backyard, or whisper secrets while lying on the floor of Lena's room, gazing up at the stars they'd painted on the ceiling. Lena often helped Evan with his homework, offering patience and a steady hand. Their bond had formed out of a shared understanding. Though Lena was older and liked to remind Evan that she was the big sister, there was a sense of protectiveness that went both ways. Evan admired Lena's courage. She'd been his anchor through their parents' divorce, offering him comfort in the middle of the night and telling him stories until he drifted back to sleep. But everything began to shift one warm Saturday afternoon when Rachel, with a shy smile, announced she'd met someone. "His name is Dean," she said, her eyes sparkling in a way Evan hadn't seen in years. "He's kind and thoughtful, and I really want you both to meet him." Evan looked at Lena, whose face remained neutral, her eyes focused on the ground. He couldn't quite place why, but there was something unsettling in the air, like a strange breeze had blown into their home. Though Evan didn't fully understand what it meant for his mother to meet someone, he knew that this new man, Dean, was somehow important to her. Not long after, Dean made his first appearance. He arrived with an easy smile, carrying a box of donuts for the family. Tall, with dark hair, and eyes that seemed friendly, Dean wore crisp business-casual clothes that gave him an air of professionalism. Rachel beamed at him, laughing at his jokes and looking at him in a way that made her seem lighter, like she'd been carrying a weight she was now able to set down. "Hi, Evan," Dean said, bending down slightly to shake Evan's hand. "Your mom's told me a lot about you. And you must be Lena," he added, turning toward her with a smile that lingered just a second too long. Lena offered a polite smile, but kept her hands tucked into her sleeves, avoiding his outstretched hand. Evan noticed her discomfort, though he couldn't understand why. Dean seemed nice enough, with his calm voice and seemingly harmless jokes. Over the next few weeks, Dean's visits became more frequent, almost blending seamlessly into their daily routine. He'd come by after work, sometimes with flowers for Rachel, other times with small gifts for Evan and Lena. Rachel's laughter filled the house more often, her voice ringing with newfound happiness. Evan, too, couldn't help but feel a small thrill whenever Dean would bring something special for him. A comic book, a pack of trading cards, small tokens that made Evan feel noticed and appreciated. But Lena remained distant, her face growing increasingly reserved whenever Dean was around. She had once been bright and lively, often taking charge in their games and laughing loudly at her own jokes. Now, though, Evan noticed her retreating into her room more frequently, closing the door behind her and staying quiet for longer periods. She no longer joined in their post-dinner games or hung out with Evan in the backyard like she used to. One evening, after Dean had left, Evan found Lena sitting on her bed, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes downcast. The shift in her demeanor troubled him, so he asked her, "Are you okay, Lena?" She gave him a small smile and shrugged. "Just tired," she replied, brushing off his concern. But Evan could sense something deeper, a hesitation lingering in her voice that didn't quite match the Lena he knew. As time passed, Evan began to pick up on small details, like how Lena would freeze up slightly when Dean entered a room, or how she'd tense up whenever he spoke directly to her. At first, Evan thought he was imagining things. Dean was charming with Rachel, always thoughtful, always polite. Rachel seemed so happy, something Evan hadn't seen in her since before the divorce. Yet, every time Dean was around, Lena grew quieter and more withdrawn. One Saturday afternoon, Rachel gathered Evan and Lena in the living room with a big smile on her face. "I have exciting news," she announced, practically glowing. "Dean's moving in with us." Evan looked at Lena, expecting her to share his excitement, or at least some reaction. But her face was pale, her lips pressed together in a thin line as she looked down at the carpet. Evan's heart twisted as he realized just how much Lena was bothered by Dean's presence. She said nothing, though, and their mother continued talking, lost in her own joy. As they went to bed that night, Evan could hear a faint sound through the thin wall separating his room from Lena's. A muffled, soft cry, barely audible but unmistakable. Evan lay in bed, unable to shake the image of Lena's downcast eyes and trembling hands. His sister, who had always been his strength, now seemed like she was wilting, withdrawing into herself, and Evan felt a pang of worry deep in his chest. Something was wrong. He didn't know what, but he was certain of it. In the weeks following Dean's move-in, the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift, settling into a pattern that was both familiar and strange. Dean's belongings were gradually integrated into their home, his clothes in the closet next to Rachel's, his cologne bottle on the bathroom sink, his sports trophies on the living room shelf. The change was subtle, but to Evan, it felt like Dean's presence was now firmly imprinted into their everyday lives. For Evan, the adjustment wasn't too difficult. Dean was friendly enough, often bringing him small gifts like a baseball glove or his favorite brand of snack. When they watched games together on the weekend, Dean would explain the rules to him and even teach him a few tips on throwing a curveball. Evan enjoyed these moments. It was as if he finally had someone to fill the father role during the week, bridging the absence of his dad, David, who lived across town. But Lena was a different story. As the days turned into weeks, Evan began noticing subtle changes in his sister. She'd once been outgoing, quick to laugh, and constantly engaged in activities around the house. Now, she seemed to be withdrawing into herself, like a flower wilting in shadow. She spent more time in her room, closing the door and only emerging when necessary. At dinner, she rarely spoke, only offering polite responses when prompted. Evan tried to bring it up casually one night after dinner, as he and Lena were washing dishes together. He nudged her gently with his elbow and whispered, "What's up with you lately? You're always so quiet." Lena glanced around as if ensuring no one else could hear, then shrugged without meeting his gaze. "I'm just tired," she muttered, focusing intently on scrubbing a stubborn spot on a plate. "Tired? You never used to be this quiet," he pressed, concern creeping into his voice. "I said I'm fine, Evan," she replied, her tone firmer this time. She gave him a quick, forced smile and then retreated to her room, leaving Evan alone with the dishes and a growing sense of unease. Despite her reassurances, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that Lena was holding something back. Dean had been nothing but nice to Evan, but he noticed how Lena always seemed to tense up when Dean was nearby. She'd inch away from him whenever he entered a room, almost as if she was trying to make herself invisible. He saw her hands clench into fists under the table whenever Dean placed his hand on her shoulder or addressed her with a nickname. These small signs built up, each one reinforcing Evan's sense that something was wrong. One evening, when Rachel was at work and Dean was busy watching TV downstairs, Evan mustered up the courage to confront Lena again. He knocked softly on her bedroom door, and after a moment, she opened it, her face visibly tired, with shadows under her eyes that Evan hadn't noticed before. "Can I come in?" he asked gently. Lena nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat cross-legged on her bed, a silence hanging heavily between them. "What's going on, Lena?" Evan whispered, keeping his voice low. "I can tell something's wrong. You used to laugh all the time, but now you barely smile." Lena looked away, her gaze fixed on a corner of her room. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's nothing you need to worry about, Evan. I'm just going through some stuff. But I'm your little brother," he pressed, not willing to let it drop. "I can tell when you're not okay." For a fleeting moment, her face softened, and Evan thought she might finally open up to him. But just as quickly, her expression closed off, and she gave a small, bitter laugh. "You wouldn't understand," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Then help me understand," Evan replied, frustration and worry blending in his voice. "Tell me what's wrong. Is it about Dean?" At the mention of Dean, Lena's face hardened and she shook her head quickly, standing up and turning away. "Just drop it, Evan. I'm fine, really." But Evan saw the faint tremor in her hands, and it told him everything he needed to know. He decided not to push her further, sensing that her reluctance ran deep, but he couldn't ignore the growing feeling of dread that seemed to settle in his chest, especially whenever he saw Lena stiffen in Dean's presence. Then, one Saturday morning, while Rachel was at work, Evan overheard a conversation that troubled him even more. Lena had just left her room, planning to go for a walk around the neighborhood. As she descended the stairs, Dean, who had been waiting in the hallway, intercepted her. "Going somewhere, Lena?" Dean asked with a smile that, to Evan, seemed a little too forced. "Just out for a walk," she mumbled, her eyes flickering to the door. Dean stepped slightly closer, and though his tone remained light, Evan noticed a faint edge to his words. "Why so distant lately? We're supposed to be family now, you know?" Evan's heart raced as he watched Lena's face. Her discomfort was obvious. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and her shoulders seemed to shrink as she avoided his gaze. I just need some space," Lena murmured, her voice barely audible. Dean chuckled softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair behind her ear. "Come on, Lena, don't be like that. You know I only want what's best for you." Evan's stomach twisted. He couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but the sight of Dean standing so close to Lena, touching her hair like that, it didn't feel right. He wanted to rush down the stairs, to pull Lena away, to demand Dean back off. But he was frozen in place, too young to fully understand the situation, yet old enough to sense the discomfort radiating from his sister. Dean's tone remained light as he added, "Let's try to get along, okay? I'd hate for things to get tense around here." Lena nodded quickly, her face a mask of forced neutrality, then hurried out the door. Evan watched as she practically sprinted down the sidewalk, her shoulders hunched, her head down. Evan's chest tightened. It was as if Lena was trapped, unable to express her fears openly, and forced to endure whatever it was that was making her withdraw. He knew now, with absolute certainty, that her change in behavior wasn't due to school stress or teenage angst. Something about Dean was making her uneasy, more than uneasy even. And he was beginning to realize that his sister needed his support more than ever, even if she wasn't ready to talk about it. The conversation he overheard that morning solidified his suspicions. Dean wasn't just a well-meaning man trying to bond with his stepchildren. Evan felt an instinctive urge to protect Lena, to shield her from whatever invisible threat Dean represented. But he was just a 10-year-old kid, and no one else seemed to notice what he saw. No one, except for Lena. As Evan's unease grew, so did his determination to keep a closer watch on Dean. Though his mother, Rachel, seemed to see only the good in Dean, Evan could no longer ignore the way his sister, Lena, recoiled from Dean's presence. She had withdrawn so much that she was almost like a shadow in their home, and Evan couldn't shake the feeling that Dean's intentions toward Lena weren't as innocent as he appeared. One Saturday afternoon, Dean offered to take Evan and Lena to the local mall. While Evan was excited at first, hoping to browse through the comic book store, he noticed Lena's face turn pale. She nodded politely, but her reluctance was visible in the tightness of her jaw and the way she avoided meeting Dean's gaze. In the car, she sat with her body angled as far from Dean as possible, staring out the window and avoiding conversation. Dean seemed to notice but didn't say anything, humming along to the radio as he drove. At the mall, after an hour of browsing and some snacks in the food court, Dean led them to a small boutique filled with gifts and trinkets. Dean picked out a small necklace with a delicate charm and handed it to Lena. "Here," he said, his voice soft. "A little something for you." Lena accepted it hesitantly, glancing at Evan as if asking for reassurance. The moment seemed odd to Evan. Why would Dean buy Lena a gift like that? But he kept silent, watching Lena carefully. She muttered a quiet, "Thank you," putting the necklace in her pocket rather than around her neck. Later that afternoon, Evan and Lena found themselves sitting in the back seat of the car again, with Dean still chatting away. Evan noticed Dean's hand resting on Lena's shoulder, a gesture that lingered just a second too long. Lena stiffened, her body turning rigid as she edged away as subtly as she could. But when she tried to shrug his hand off, Dean merely laughed and gave her shoulder a squeeze, his tone far too cheerful. "Relax, Lena," he chuckled. "You're so tense lately. It's like you don't trust me." Evan's fists clenched. He felt an instinctive urge to intervene, but something held him back. He was only 10 after all, and confronting Dean directly felt impossible. Yet, the look on Lena's face was enough to make his stomach twist with discomfort. Back at home, Evan tried to talk to Lena in private. She was about to retreat to her room when he stopped her in the hallway. "Lena," he whispered, glancing around to make sure Dean wasn't nearby. Is Dean making you uncomfortable?" Lena froze, her expression betraying a flash of fear. She bit her lip, her gaze darting to the stairs, where she could hear Dean laughing with their mother in the kitchen. "It's nothing, Evan," she murmured. "Just leave it." But Evan couldn't just leave it. As the days went by, he watched Dean's behavior with sharper eyes. He noted every small gesture, every look that lingered a second too long. He even started writing down incidents that felt off, recording them in a small notebook he kept hidden in his sock drawer. On Tuesday evening, when Rachel was at work, Dean knocked on Lena's bedroom door and asked her to come downstairs. Evan had been in his own room, but when he heard Dean's voice, he peeked out into the hallway, his curiosity overpowering his better judgment. "Why don't you help me out in the kitchen, Lena?" Dean suggested as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "We can make dinner together." Evan watched as Lena hesitated before nodding, following Dean into the kitchen with a look of resignation. He tiptoed down the stairs and crouched near the doorway, out of sight, but close enough to hear their conversation. Dean's voice was cheerful, but there was an underlying tension to it that made Evan's skin crawl. "You know, Lena, I really want us to get along. We're going to be living together for a long time, so we should try to make things easy on each other, right?" "Right." Lena's response was barely audible, her voice carrying a strain that Evan could hear clearly. She sounded like she was trying to keep calm, to avoid angering him. Dean continued, chopping vegetables with a little too much force. "Good. I know your mom is very happy, and I'd hate for anything to make her sad. Especially, unnecessary drama." Evan felt his blood run cold. There was a warning in Dean's tone that was unmistakable, a subtle reminder for Lena to stay silent. Evan clenched his fists, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and frustration. His sister shouldn't have to deal with this alone, and he couldn't stand by and watch Dean intimidate her into silence. Lena's response was a quiet, resigned, "I understand." When Rachel returned home that night, Dean's mood shifted back to his usual cheerful self. He greeted her warmly, even gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, and launched into a story about his day at work. Rachel smiled, unaware of the tension that had filled the kitchen just hours before. Evan watched his mother's reaction with a sinking heart. To her, Dean was the perfect partner, a man who filled the void after her divorce, someone she could lean on. She didn't see the side of him that Evan and Lena were beginning to fear. Evan wanted to tell her everything, to warn her about Dean, but he knew she wouldn't listen. Her happiness with Dean was blinding her to the way he made her children feel. As he lay in bed that night, Evan turned over the events of the past few days in his mind. He knew he needed more than just words to convince his mother that something was wrong with Dean. He needed evidence, something solid that would show her the truth. Determined, Evan pulled out his notebook and wrote down everything he had observed, each incident in painstaking detail. It was his only way to make sense of it all, to remind himself that he wasn't imagining things. He wrote about the times Dean lingered too close to Lena, the times he bought her gifts she didn't want, and the veiled threats he made when no one else was around. Each entry filled him with a greater sense of purpose, a realization that he would do whatever it took to protect his sister, even if it meant facing someone far more powerful than him. Evan found Lena immediately. They sat cross-legged on her bed, the dim glow of a small bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken fears. Evan had waited for this moment all day, hoping to find a time when they could speak without fear of Dean overhearing. "Lena," Evan whispered, breaking the silence, "we have to do something. I can't stand watching you go through this. He's dangerous." Lena's shoulders slumped, and she stared at her hands, nervously picking at her fingernails. "What can we do?" she murmured. "Mom won't listen, and if Dean finds out we're trying to stop him?" Her voice trailed off, her fear unmistakable. Evan leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "What if we collect proof? Like, record what he's doing, write everything down, keep track of it all. Then Mom would have to believe us, right?" Lena looked up, a flicker of hope in her eyes, but it quickly faded. "That's a lot of work, Evan." And what if he catches us? He won't catch us, Evan insisted, determination hardening his young voice. We'll be careful. We could even make up a signal, something that only we know. That way, if you ever need me, I'll come right away. The idea seemed to settle over Lena, and she nodded slowly, the beginnings of a plan taking root. A signal, she repeated thoughtfully. That might work. Evan thought for a moment before reaching over and knocking on the wall between their rooms in a specific pattern. 3 quick knocks, followed by 2 slower ones. If you're ever in trouble and you need me, do this on the wall. I'll come right away, okay? Lena's face softened, and for the first time in days, she managed a small smile. Thank you, Evan. You don't know how much it means to me, knowing you're here. They spent the next hour laying out the details of their secret plan. Evan would continue to document everything he saw in his notebook. Every unsettling glance, every unwelcome touch, every word that hinted at something darker beneath Dean's cheerful exterior. Meanwhile, Lena would work on keeping her distance from Dean whenever possible, and using the signal if she ever felt truly unsafe. I'll find a way to record things, Evan whispered, feeling a strange sense of maturity beyond his years. Maybe I can use that old phone Mom gave me for games. It has a voice recorder. I'll just tell her I'm using it for fun. The weight of the plan hung heavily between them, but they both felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were no longer helpless. They had each other, and that bond gave them strength, a shield of sorts against Dean's looming presence. As they sealed their plan with a pinky promise, Evan could see a flicker of hope in Lena's eyes, a glimmer that had been missing for weeks. The days that followed were tense as Evan and Lena adjusted to their plan. Every interaction with Dean felt like a calculated risk, each moment requiring careful observation. Evan kept his notebook with him at all times, hidden in his backpack. He jotted down everything he saw and heard, each entry strengthening his resolve to protect his sister. One evening, as Evan was working on his homework in the living room, he overheard Dean talking to Lena in the kitchen. He couldn't hear every word, but the tone of Dean's voice sent a chill down his spine. There was an edge to it, something controlling and menacing. He edged closer, careful not to be seen, straining to catch fragments of their conversation. Lena, it's rude to avoid someone who's trying to be nice. Dean's voice floated through the doorway, smooth but carrying an underlying threat. I'm not avoiding you, Lena replied, her voice small. I just have a lot of homework, that's all. Homework? You can make a little time for me, can't you? Dean's voice softened in a way that made Evan feel sick. After all, we're family now, aren't we? Evan clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He scribbled down Dean's words in his notebook as soon as he could, his hand shaking slightly. He wanted to rush into the kitchen and pull Lena away, but he knew he had to be cautious. Their plan depended on subtlety, and he couldn't risk alerting Dean to their suspicions. When Rachel came home later, she was exhausted from work, her usual cheerful demeanor dimmed by fatigue. As she hung up her coat, Dean took her hand, leading her into the living room. Rachel, honey, I was thinking we should spend more family time together, he said, giving her a smile that Evan could only describe as too perfect. Lena's been a bit distant lately. Maybe a little extra bonding time would help bring us all closer. Rachel smiled, seemingly charmed by the idea. That sounds lovely, Dean. I think the kids could use some more family time too, especially with you here now. Evan glanced at Lena, who had slipped into the room silently, her face expressionless but her posture tense. She met his eyes briefly, and he recognized the quiet plea in her gaze. She felt trapped, unable to voice her discomfort to their mother, and it broke Evan's heart to see her like that. Dean's family bonding sessions became a regular occurrence over the next week. He would suggest game nights or ask Lena to help him cook, always finding a way to be near her, to make her feel uncomfortable. Evan watched each interaction closely, filling his notebook with notes, dates, and times. He even managed to capture a few whispered threats on the old phone Rachel had given him, though he kept the recordings hidden, fearing what Dean might do if he found out. One afternoon, as Evan was recording one of these interactions from the hallway, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Lena, remember what I told you? Dean's voice was barely audible, laced with menace. You wouldn't want to make things difficult for your mother, would you? She's finally happy again, and I'd hate for her to lose that. Lena's voice was shaky as she replied, I understand. I won't say anything. Evan's hands trembled as he stopped the recording, his heart heavy with fear and anger. Dean was using their mother's happiness as a weapon against Lena, manipulating her silence. The more Evan learned, the clearer it became that they needed to act quickly. He shared everything with Lena that evening, showing her his notebook and the recordings. She was silent as she read through his notes, her face pale and drawn. But when she looked up, there was a newfound determination in her eyes. "Thank you, Evan," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I didn't know you'd done so much." Evan placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring smile. "We're in this together. We'll find a way to make Mom see the truth, I promise." But as the days continued, Dean's behavior grew more bold. He started dropping hints to Evan, little reminders that he was being watched. "Make sure to mind your own business, Evan," Dean said one evening, leaning down to meet Evan's gaze. His smile was tight, his eyes cold. "You wouldn't want to get involved in things that don't concern you. Trust me." Evan swallowed, nodding obediently, but inside he felt a surge of defiance. Dean's threats only strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't let this man intimidate him, and he certainly wouldn't let him harm Lena any longer. They were running out of time, and Evan knew it. He could sense Dean's patience wearing thin, his mask slipping more each day. But Evan's fear was tempered by the knowledge that he wasn't alone. He had Lena, and together they would find a way to expose Dean's true nature. As he lay in bed that night, Evan could only hope that their growing evidence would be enough. He clutched his notebook tightly, his determination unwavering, knowing that he would protect his sister. As he searched for a way to gather stronger proof, he remembered an old voice recorder stashed in a drawer in the garage. It was something his dad had used during his college days, and Evan hoped it still worked. With the voice recorder hidden in his pocket, he decided to place it discreetly in the living room, where Dean often spent time with Lena whenever their mother wasn't around. If he could capture even one incriminating moment, it might be enough to get their mom to listen. Evan felt nervous about setting the device up, especially with the risks involved, but he knew this was his best option. He took a deep breath and crept downstairs late one night, when everyone else was asleep. As he made his way to the living room, he hid the recorder carefully beneath a pile of old magazines on the bookshelf. The placement gave a clear line of sound from the main seating area without being obvious to someone casually glancing around. The next day, Evan held his breath as Dean approached Lena in the kitchen. He pretended to be reading on the couch, but he kept his attention on Dean and Lena's conversation, his gaze fixed on his book while his ears picked up every word. "Lena, you haven't been very friendly lately," Dean said smoothly, his voice filled with a forced gentleness. "We're going to be a family soon. Don't you want us to get along?" Lena's face remained neutral, but Evan could tell she was uncomfortable. I just have a lot on my mind. School's been really busy." Dean stepped closer, too close, resting his hand on her shoulder. "I could help you with that. You know, I'm here for you anytime you need." Lena's discomfort was plain, and Evan could feel the tension in the air as she subtly leaned away from Dean's touch. "Thank you, but I'm fine," she replied, her voice tight. Evan clenched his jaw, anger simmering as he watched his sister forced into this charade. His eyes flicked to the bookshelf where he'd hidden the recorder. He hoped it was capturing every word. Later that evening, as everyone else went to bed, Evan waited until the house was silent. He tiptoed down to the living room and retrieved the recorder, holding it close as he returned to his room. Heart pounding, he hit the play button, listening to the interaction between Dean and Lena. Every subtle manipulation, every veiled threat was there, clear as day. This was it, proof of Dean's true nature. The next morning, however, Dean seemed to notice something was off. He watched Evan more closely than usual, his gaze sharp, assessing. Evan felt his skin prickle under the weight of Dean's stare. Dean knew something was going on, and that only added to the tension brewing in their home. "Evan," Dean said in a low, too casual tone as he cornered him in the hallway later that day, "I've noticed you've been very observant lately." Evan's heart raced, but he kept his face neutral. "Just making sure things are okay," he replied, hoping he sounded casual. Dean's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's good, son. But remember," he said, his voice dropping lower, "sometimes curiosity can be a dangerous thing." Evan swallowed hard, nodding, but inside, his resolve only grew stronger. Dean's words confirmed what he already knew. They were on borrowed time, and if he and Lena didn't act soon, Dean might do something worse. That night, Evan shared the recording with Lena, playing the clip in hushed tones as they huddled together in her room. Her face went pale as she listened, her hands clenching into fists. "This is it," Evan whispered. "We have what we need to show Mom." But Lena hesitated, biting her lip. "What if she still doesn't believe us, Evan? What if she just says we're overreacting?" Evan looked her in the eyes, his voice firm. "Then we'll make her believe us. This is our best chance, Lena. We can't stay silent anymore." With a final nod, they agreed to confront their mother the following day, bracing themselves for what they hoped would be the turning point in their fight against Dean. They didn't know how Rachel would react, but they knew one thing for certain. They could no longer let their fear hold them back. The day passed in tense anticipation. Evan and Lena stayed close to each other, each minute stretching longer than the last. They both knew what they had to do, but felt the weight of uncertainty about how their mother would respond. However, that evening, Rachel unexpectedly received a call from work, and as much as she tried to stay, she was needed for an emergency night shift at the hospital. "I'll be back around midnight," she said, glancing apologetically at Evan and Lena as she prepared to leave. "You two behave and get to bed on time, all right?" Evan and Lena exchanged a worried glance, but they nodded. As soon as Rachel left, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Dean was in charge, and his presence felt heavier than ever. The evening wore on with an uneasy calm. Dean lingered around the house, keeping a close eye on Evan and Lena. When they both retreated to their rooms, they could still hear his footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway. As the clock ticked closer to bedtime, Lena's anxiety grew, her stomach knotting with fear. Finally, unable to handle the tension any longer, she gave Evan their secret signal, a series of 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slower ones on the wall they shared. Evan was at her door in moments, his face tense. "Something's not right, Evan," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "I feel like he's waiting for something." Evan swallowed, nodding. "Just stay calm. Remember, if anything happens, we'll call for help. You're not alone." They returned to their rooms, but Evan kept a vigilant ear pressed to the wall, every sound amplified by his own mounting dread. A few moments later, he heard it. The slow creak of footsteps outside Lena's door, followed by the faint sound of Dean's voice. "Lena," Dean called softly, his voice dripping with an unsettling sweetness. "Hey, it's just me. Can I come in for a minute?" Evan's heart pounded as he strained to listen from his room, his fists clenched tightly. Through the wall, he could barely make out Lena's shaky reply. I'm getting ready for bed, Dean." Dean's voice softened even further, taking on a tone that sounded almost fatherly. "I just wanted to help you with that homework, remember? Your mom mentioned you were struggling a bit in math. I'm pretty good with numbers, you know." Evan gritted his teeth, sensing the manipulation in Dean's tone. Dean continued, his voice coaxing. "Come on, just let me take a quick look. I can show you a few easy tricks. Your mom would be really happy if you got a good grade on this one. It'll only take a minute, I promise." But still, Lena didn't open the door. Her voice came out even softer, edged with unease. Thanks, but I think I've got it covered. I'll try again tomorrow." Dean's tone darkened slightly, but he quickly forced it back to a syrupy sweetness. "Oh, come on, Lena. Don't be like that. I'm just trying to help. You know, if we're going to be family, it's important that you trust me." There was a long, uncomfortable pause, and then Dean's voice came again, soft and coaxing, like he was speaking to a child. "Come on, Lena," he murmured. "Just a quick chat. I promise it'll only take a minute." He let the words linger, his tone deceptively gentle, with just the faintest hint of irritation creeping in, like a storm brewing beneath the surface. Evan's heart pounded as he pressed his ear closer to the wall. He could feel the tension thickening in the silence that stretched between Dean and Lena's closed door. Still, Lena said nothing, and the quiet stretched painfully long. Dean's voice came again, lower this time, a dark edge slicing through the sweetness. "Lena, open the door, now!" There was a cold finality to his words, the false patience all but vanished. "I don't like being ignored." Inside her room, Lena took a small, involuntary step back, her breaths coming shallow and quick. Her eyes darted to the door as she wrapped her arms tightly around herself, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Evan's chest tightened as he imagined her standing there, alone and terrified, just a few feet away from him. Then, the tension broke like a clap of thunder. Dean's voice, sharp and furious, cut through the silence like a blade. "Lena, I said open this door. Don't make me ask again." When she didn't respond, Evan heard a low, frustrated growl from the other side of the wall, followed by a loud, forceful crack as Dean pounded his fist against the door, his patience dissolving into rage. "Enough games, Lena," he snarled, each word thick with menace. He hit the door again, harder this time, the force rattling the hinges. "Open the door!" Evan's blood ran cold, his heart hammering so loudly he was afraid Dean might hear it through the wall. Lena backed up further, her eyes wide as she clutched a trembling hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She was out of options, cornered in her own room. And then it happened. Dean's patience snapped completely. With a savage, frustrated roar, he threw his full weight against the door. Wood splintered as the door buckled, the lock giving way with a sickening crunch. The door flew open, slamming against the wall, and Dean stood in the doorway, his face twisted with barely restrained fury. Evan could barely stand it anymore. He bolted out of his room, creeping toward the kitchen where the landline phone was. As soon as he reached it, he picked up the receiver and dialed 911, his fingers trembling. When the dispatcher answered, he whispered, "Please help. My mom's boyfriend is trying to hurt my sister. Our mom's not here. We're alone." The dispatcher calmly asked for the address, and Evan relayed it, his heart pounding in his chest. "Just stay on the line, sweetie," the dispatcher said. "Help is on the way. Are you safe?" "I'm in the kitchen," he whispered. "My sister. She's in her room with him." Evan heard Lena's muffled voice, her words barely discernible through the wall, but the distress was unmistakable. Dean's tone had shifted, his voice no longer coaxing, but dark, insistent. "Remember what I told you," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You wouldn't want to do anything that would ruin your mother's happiness, right?" Suddenly, Evan heard the unmistakable sound of police sirens approaching. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, cutting through the darkness and bathing the house in a surreal glow. Dean's voice fell silent, and Evan felt a wave of relief as the sound of doors slamming shut outside signaled the arrival of help. Within seconds, 2 officers were at the door, and Evan raced to let them in. "He's upstairs," he whispered, pointing toward the hall where Lena's room was. The officers moved swiftly, one motioning for Evan to stay back. They made their way up the stairs, their footsteps loud in the otherwise silent house. Evan watched as they reached Lena's room, the male officer standing in front of the door while the female officer knocked firmly. "Police, step away from the girl and keep your hands where we can see them." Evan heard a thud, followed by Dean's shocked protest. "This is a misunderstanding. I was just talking to her." But the officers were unyielding. "Step away and come with us," the male officer commanded, his voice firm. Seconds later, Lena appeared in the doorway, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She spotted Evan and ran to him, her hands trembling as she clutched his arm. Evan pulled her close, his relief palpable. As the officers led Dean away in handcuffs, he shouted over his shoulder, his voice seething with anger. "This is all a mistake. Rachel will understand. She knows I'm a good man." But Evan and Lena didn't care to listen. They held onto each other tightly, their fear slowly easing as they watched the police car disappear into the distance, taking Dean with it. A few minutes later, Rachel's car pulled into the driveway. She ran inside, her face a mixture of confusion and concern, as she took in the flashing lights and the officers still in her home. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes wide with shock, as she looked at Evan and Lena. Evan took a deep breath, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Mom, Dean isn't who you think he is. We had to call the police." Rachel looked between her 2 children, her face pale as she processed what had happened. Slowly, realization dawned in her eyes, the denial and disbelief replaced with understanding and horror. Tears filled her eyes as she knelt in front of them, her hands shaking. "Oh my God," she whispered, reaching out to hold them. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't see it." Evan and Lena clung to her, the weight of the night's events finally beginning to sink in. They were safe, but the journey to heal had only just begun. Together they held on tightly, a family finally united in truth and, at last, free from the shadow Dean had cast over their lives. The aftermath of the night's events lingered heavily in the house. The police had taken Dean away, but the silence left behind felt almost more haunting. Rachel sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze distant and filled with disbelief. Evan and Lena sat across from her, side by side, clinging to each other for comfort and strength. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel took a shaky breath, looking directly at her children for the first time that night. I don't understand. How could this happen? Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Lena looked at Evan, and he gave her a slight nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, she met her mother's eyes, her voice trembling but resolute. Mom, I tried to tell you. I felt uncomfortable around Dean for a long time. He wasn't the person you thought he was. Rachel's face paled, and she reached out as if to touch Lena, but then hesitated. Why didn't I see it? Why didn't I listen? She clutched her hands together, her voice filled with remorse. I wanted to believe. I just wanted to be happy. I thought he could make us a family again. Evan held out the small, tattered notebook he'd kept hidden, filled with detailed notes of Dean's behavior, the recordings of conversations, and every suspicious incident he and Lena had experienced. We tried to gather proof so you'd believe us, Mom. This is everything Dean did, everything we saw and heard. Lena and I didn't know what else to do. Rachel took the notebook with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the words Evan had so carefully written. With each page, her expression shifted from disbelief to horror, her fingers pressing to her lips as the evidence sank in. Tears filled her eyes as she read about the times Dean had cornered Lena, the threatening conversations, and the casual invasions of personal space. Her mind reeled with every entry, and she looked up at her children, heartbroken. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I didn't protect you. I thought he loved us. I thought he was good. Lena looked away, the pain of her mother's blindness still fresh. I tried to tell you, but you just kept saying I was being dramatic, or that I was misunderstanding him. Every time I asked for help, you said I was imagining things. Rachel's face crumpled with guilt, and tears slipped down her cheeks. I was so wrapped up in my own happiness, in my own need to feel complete again, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I put my own feelings above yours. She looked at Lena, her voice full of desperation. Please, forgive me. I should have listened. I should have known better. Evan looked at his sister, sensing the weight of her mixed emotions. He gently squeezed her hand, and she took a deep breath, letting herself meet their mother's pleading gaze. I need time, Mom. We both do, she whispered. You might have wanted him in our lives, but I just wanted you to protect us. Rachel nodded, her expression one of pain and understanding. I'll do anything to make it right. I'll go to therapy. I'll take time to understand everything I missed. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness right now, but I promise, I'll earn it back. She reached out to them, and though Lena hesitated, Evan finally moved forward, hugging her tightly. A moment later, Lena joined, her embrace tentative but sincere. The three of them sat there in silence, feeling the pain of betrayal, but also the first glimmer of hope that they might rebuild. Over the next few days, Rachel took time off work, determined to show her children that her focus was on them and their healing. She arranged for each of them to start therapy, and she found a therapist for herself to understand the choices she had made and how to be a better parent. She also reached out to David, their father, explaining everything. David, horrified but grateful for the honesty, agreed to let Evan and Lena stay with him while Rachel worked on restoring the family trust. Before they left, Rachel knelt before them, her voice full of regret and determination. I love you both more than anything, and I know I let you down, but I'm going to spend every day proving to you that I'll never let you down again. Please, let me try to make it up to you. Evan and Lena hugged their mother goodbye, both of them filled with mixed emotions, love, betrayal, hope, and pain. But as they drove away with their father, each of them felt a sense of relief, knowing they were finally safe and that, perhaps, healing could truly begin. As Evan and Lena settled into their father David's house, the weight of the previous weeks began to slowly lift. David, a steady and gentle presence in their lives, provided them with a newfound sense of safety. His house, once a weekend retreat, now felt like a sanctuary where they could finally start to heal. David was mindful of their emotions, keeping his approach warm and respectful. Instead of probing, he encouraged them to take each day as it came. You don't have to rush anything, he said one morning as they sat around the breakfast table. Just know I'm here when you need me. Their father also introduced a new routine, one built around consistency and stability. After-school movie nights and regular family dinners became a comforting norm, a stark contrast to the unease that had settled in their previous home. David's kindness and patience made the space feel more and more like home with each passing day. A few days into their stay, David drove them to their first therapy appointments. Evan and Lena were understandably nervous, unsure of what to expect. David noticed their hesitation and offered some reassuring words. Therapy is just a safe place to talk, and your therapist is someone who's there to help you make sense of everything. It's okay if you're not ready to say much at first. Lena's therapist, Dr. Carter, specialized in working with teens and young adults, and her gentle approach immediately put Lena at ease. The walls of Dr. Carter's office were painted a soothing blue, and soft, warm lights replaced the usual clinical brightness. There were cozy chairs, a shelf lined with books, and even a small sand-filled tray with tiny figurines, things Dr. Carter explained she could use to help express her feelings. At first, Lena found it hard to open up. She sat silently, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater, while Dr. Carter patiently waited. "Whenever you're ready," Dr. Carter said softly, her eyes kind and understanding. After a few sessions, Lena found herself speaking more freely. She talked about the discomfort she had felt around Dean, her fear of not being believed, and the heartbreak of her mother's dismissal. Dr. Carter listened, helping Lena process each memory and encouraging her to replace fear with strength. Slowly, Lena began to trust her therapist and herself, realizing that her feelings had been valid all along. Meanwhile, Evan attended his own sessions with Dr. Martinez, a therapist who worked well with younger kids. Dr. Martinez was warm and approachable, making the sessions feel more like a conversation than an interrogation. He had a stack of comic books on his desk, and Evan noticed a Spider-Man poster on the wall. It wasn't long before Evan opened up about how he'd felt responsible for Lena, like he was her protector. "It's okay to feel protective," Dr. Martinez explained, "but you were also just a kid in a really hard situation. It took a lot of courage to help your sister. But remember, you don't have to carry the weight of everything alone. It's important to take care of yourself, too." Through these sessions, Evan began to understand that bravery didn't mean he had to be strong all the time. He could ask for help, feel scared, and still be brave. Each session became a step toward feeling less burdened by what had happened, and more like the kid he'd almost forgotten he was. Back at home, David noticed small changes in his children. Lena, who had once been quiet and withdrawn, was starting to open up more, expressing her thoughts and even laughing at his jokes. Evan, too, seemed lighter, allowing himself to relax without constantly watching over his sister. David could see them growing stronger, little by little, as they embraced the safety of their new environment. Rachel, meanwhile, was working on her own healing. She attended therapy sessions to understand why she had overlooked her children's pleas for help, and how she could rebuild the trust she had lost. Every week, she sent Evan and Lena letters filled with her thoughts and apologies, carefully choosing words that conveyed her remorse and her hope for reconciliation. Though that they weren't ready to visit their mother, they read each letter together, recognizing her effort to change and feeling a flicker of hope that, one day, they might rebuild their relationship. As the weeks turned into months, both Evan and Lena found ways to slowly return to their routines and rediscover the things they loved. Lena returned to dance, joining a new studio closer to David's house. Her new instructor, Miss Holly, was understanding and kind, allowing Lena to take things at her own pace. Slowly, Lena began to enjoy dancing again, the music and movements giving her a sense of freedom and confidence she hadn't felt in a long time. Evan, too, found joy in little things, like his favorite comics and weekend outings with his dad. David even took him to a comic convention, where Evan felt the weight of his worries melt away as he immersed himself in a world of superheroes and adventure. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Lena looked at her dad and brother, a soft smile on her face. "I feel like I can finally breathe again," she admitted. Her words hung in the air, a simple statement filled with the relief and hope she had started to feel. David reached across the table, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're both so strong. You've been through a lot, but you're finding your way back. I'm so proud of you." Evan nodded, looking at Lena with admiration. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of worry pressing down on him. He felt safe, surrounded by family, and ready to face whatever came next. The road to healing wasn't over, but they were well on their way. Together, They were creating new memories, ones filled with laughter, support, and the unbreakable bond that had helped them through even the darkest moments. And in this newfound peace, they discovered the strength to forgive, grow, and start anew. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.